thanks to the organizers for this interesting meeting. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I should have had the word memory in here, so it should be strong error-correcting codes and exponential memory capacity in neural representations. The question came up yesterday, what is it that brains do that might offer a promise for improving upon conventional computing, right? And can we build exascale computers? Can we do some of these things? So I don't know the answer to these questions, and obviously none of us do really in this room, but I hope that today I can provide you a couple of interesting examples, one directly from the brain, one inspired by the brain, of computing that really is qualitatively different from the kinds of computing that we normally think about in conventional computers. Okay, so just like Pentti made the case for you yesterday, I want to make a few observations about neural representation. It's high dimensional. It's very distributed, it's parallel, and it's implemented by dynamical systems involving elements that are each relatively short-lived or memoryless in their responses, in their individual dynamics. And what I want to show you is that these properties can lead to really qualitatively new and interesting capabilities. Okay, so let me start directly with an example from the brain, okay? And some of you may have heard of grid cells. So I'm going to talk about the grid cell code and how it enables a qualitatively different kind of representation than we have previously known about from other measured codes for variables in the sensory and motor peripheries. All right, so let me try to unpack that. So here's a picture of the response of a single cell, a single grid cell. So what you see over here, are a black line, which is the trajectory of an animal as it's running around in a box in a flat 2D plane. And the box is just about 1 meter per side. And the black is the trajectory of the animal. And each red dot here represents a spike emitted by a single neuron, right? So all of these spikes are from just a single neuron. And what you can see is that these spikes are sort of happening all over the place, unlike place cells, which most of you probably have heard about, which tend to fire at just sort of one neighborhood of a location in space. This grid cell, this particular cell, is firing in multiple locations, but also you should be able to see that the density of firing isn't uniform over this whole enclosure. In fact, the firing has these fields, these discrete blobs, and the blobs themselves are arranged in this nice periodic pattern, this nice equilateral triangular lattice pattern. Okay, so this is a cell in layer 2-3 of the entorhinal cortex. It was discovered in rats, but there's evidence since then that it exists in bats, in mice, and there's also some evidence that these cells exist in humans. So probably this is a general mammalian system and the firing of this cell is clearly related to some encoding of space. Okay, so this is one cell. All right, and so if we want to sort of formalize what it is that the cell is doing, let's just consider one-dimensional mathematical statement about what these cells are doing. So I showed you one cell. So one cell has this nice triangular lattice. If you look at a cell next to it, a neighboring cell, right? So we just go back here. The neighboring cell to this cell has also the same triangular lattice pattern, the same spatial period, the distance between the blobs. It also has the same lattice orientation, which is the orientation of these two primary lattice vectors. The only difference between neighboring cells really that are grid cells appears to be like a shift in the 2D phase, so just a 2D translation. So in other words, these different cells are together encoding location in the same way, in this periodic way, but their different responses are just phase shifts of one another. Okay, so in 1D, in blue you can think, I've just plotted one cell's periodic response, purple is another cell, and pink is a third cell, right? And so if you know that this cell is firing a lot, then you know something about position. In fact, you know that the animal is at some position x such that x mod lambda, which is the period of this periodic response, divided by lambda is, say, 1/4, which is the phase of this cell. And if you knew that the purple cell was firing, you'd know location is a phase again, but there's no information in this response about where the animal is across periods because the response repeats itself. The whole population of cells with the same period, the response repeats. So all you have information about is location modulo the period. Okay, so that's the coding of position in this whole population of grid cells. So it turns out that there's actually not just one population of grid cells, there are actually a few different populations of grid cells. So as you go along this cortical region, along one axis, this dorsal ventral boundary, there are groups of cells that have a given period, and as you systematically move up to the ventral end of the boundary, there's a systematic change, or at least there's different groups of cells have different periods. In fact, these changes in period are discrete, so there are just a few discrete different periods in the representations. And the periods all fall in some, 1 decade, very narrow range. So about 1/3 of a meter is the smallest period, and the biggest period is actually less than 3 meters. So, this is only 1 decade in scale, all right? And for reference, the kinds of distances that an animal travels over the course of the day, these rats travel 100 meters to 1 kilometer per linear dimension per day in search of food, and so that's kind of the behavioral distance scale over which they would want to encode and decode their estimates of position. Okay, so clearly even the biggest period is much, much smaller than the scales that we're talking about here. Okay, so what is the code then for position? So because there are distinct periods, the position variable x is represented in one group of neurons with the given period lambda 1 as this phase, x mod lambda 1 over lambda 1, but then there's a separate phase with respect to the second period lambda 2, and so on up to the nth period lambda n. And there are order 10 different periods in a given animal. Okay, so n is order 10. So this is what I like to call a population of population codes. Each population codes one phase, and then there's a set of populations that encode these different phase variables. Okay, so this seems really bizarre, right? I mean, you've got this position variable, which is, 2 scalar quantities, local scalar numbers, and they're being encoded by these periodic functions, and very non-local and completely periodic. So why would you want to encode position that way? So it turns out that, this kind of representation, representing a number x by its moduli, okay, modulo phases, has a name. If x is an integer and lambda is an integer, and we get rid of the dividing by lambdas, this is actually a number system. It's called a residue number system in computer science. And residue number systems are very interesting systems. So they have some interesting properties. So we're used to fixed-base number systems. So if I want to represent numbers using our conventional decimal system, you have these registers, and if you have 5 registers, 6 registers, you can represent a number as big as 10 to the 6. So you can do that. But if you use a modulo system, you can also represent a number as big as 1,000,000, but you could just use these 3 different periods or moduli, or you could alternatively use 6 different moduli, but no, there's a big difference, which is that here the moduli span many orders of magnitude in scale. Okay, but here the moduli are all about the same size. Okay, which is, from a biological point of view, this is very interesting because, as we all know, it's very tough to construct things that span many orders of magnitude in dynamic range or in size. There's a parameter that would need to be tuned to cover 6 orders of magnitude to get these different periods. Here you can get away with all periods that are roughly the same. Okay, and you get something similar. So first of all, the network parameters don't need to span several orders of magnitude, and you require only a small dynamic range. Okay, it's also very interesting for another reason. So we heard from Pentti about holographic or distributed representations, where each sort of piece of the representation carries the same weight as the other pieces. So now, if I want to represent the number 45, using a decimal representation, this is it, 800,000, this is it, 800,001, and this is it. And as I move by 1 unit, all the other registers stay unchanged, but only the 1 unit register changes, right? And so, in fact, as I move through by a unit at a time, this is the only residue or the register that changes, and only when I change by tens or hundreds or thousands or 10,000s do the other registers change. It's a very non-whitened, non-equal, non-holographic representation in that sense. By contrast, in the modulo representation, if you have roughly equal-sized moduli, a shift from 800,000 to 800,001 involves changes in all of these moduli. They're all kind of doing the same thing. It's a very distributed and whitened representation. Okay, and also, damaging if you destroy the unit here, the information in one of these registers here, you destroy information on a specific scale. Here, if you destroy one of the units, you destroy information on all scales equally. Okay, and so it's whitened in that sense. Okay, another interesting property about this modulo system, and by the way, it's not only a system for representing integers. So residue number systems are for integers. This is a generalization to representing even reals, right? A modulo operation is well defined for real numbers as well. Okay, so the other thing that's very interesting about modular arithmetic, we talked yesterday about actually the time complexity of addition. In this system, the time complexity of addition, so in decimal, if you want to do addition, or in any fixed base number system, you have to first do the smallest register, add up, look for any carryover, go on, and so on. So the time complexity in a naive system is n. In a more sophisticated system, it's like log n. It turns out that addition in modulo systems is completely parallel. So 2 plus 4 modulo 5 is 1, and so you just write that down, and even though there was a wrap around, you don't actually have to carry information over. So you can verify that the sum of 97 plus 4 written in modulo system is just 351 over here without any carries. Okay, so you need, it's completely parallel non-serial updating across moduli, so there's a speed up here. The time complexity of computing that sum does not depend on the size of the sums that are being computed. Okay, and from a biological perspective, there's an advantage because you don't have to build wiring that pushes information from one of the registers to the other. Okay, so from a neuromorphic or a biological perspective, that's also an advantage. So that's an interesting property as well. And the reason why arithmetic is an important thing to do in this grid cell representation is this system is representing position. Okay, and to represent an updated position as the animal moves has a displacement, moves by some delta x, you need to now update the position estimate by adding the displacement to the representation and then arrive at the new representation, right? So the system is constantly doing these addition operations. Okay, there's another very interesting property of the system. So this system is, this coding into these modulo residues is, it's not structure preserving or metric preserving in the following sense. So if you have two numbers, x and y, that you are representing, if there are two numbers, x and y, and they have a certain distance between them, so two positions or two locations of the animal, is a certain distance between them, it's not the case that the distance in the code words, so C of x is the modular representation, this vector code for x, the distance between these is not equal to the distance between these. In fact, the fact that it's not equal is going to be very important for what I'll tell you about the error correction properties. Okay, so it turns out that it's a very interleaving representation. It doesn't preserve metrics in this sense, but it is very crucially structure preserving in the following sense. So the more important property is that if you have a representation, the representation for x plus the representation for y equals the representation for x plus y. Okay, so it's metric preserving in that sense. So it's not like code words like I'm going to call, I'm going to assign a code word Alice Anne to x and a code word Bob to y. Those are not sort of representations that you can add. There's no sort of metric structure inherent to them. Okay, so there's some interesting algebraic properties that the system has. Okay. So what are the properties of this modular representation? Well, it is a number system. You use log as many moduli to represent large ranges, and so just like fixed base number systems, you can encode exponentially large ranges using log of that number of registers, if you will. So here, so the phases are all 0, 1 quantities. They go between 0 and 1, and there are n of them. So the space, the coding space, is this n-dimensional torus, and if you start the coding line, say you identify the 0 phase as for the position 0, and then you start moving your position variable x along some range, you start wrapping, the vector is a point here, the phase vector is a point here in this coding space, and you start wrapping around the coding space. Okay, and as x starts to increase, by the time x has moved by, say, lambda 1, the smallest period, then the coding line has wrapped around the torus in one of the dimensions completely, but not quite in the other because these are not the same period, so it's not quite wrapped around, so it's just going to keep going. It doesn't close on itself, and it keeps going and going and wrapping around, okay? So at the point when, if this line has a finite thickness, you can ask, how long is this line before the space is filled by this finite width coding line? And this is the range that can be uniquely represented of positions. And all these calculations can be done in the reals. And so it turns out that the range that can be represented scales like lambda in the front, which sets the scale, which is the period of the individual grid cell responses, and that sort of sets a scale, and since all the periods are about the same, I'm just going to give them a name, lambda. But notice, importantly, that n, which is the number of distinct periods, is up in the exponent, right? So it's possible to represent exponentially many positions uniquely using only linearly many different periods. Okay, so now it's a funny thing because okay, so what's also interesting is that now if we reduce, so this is how things behave when you scale the whole range by if you wait until the whole space is filled with this coding line, but it turns out that if you stop short of that, right? If you stop, say here where there's a lot of gray space still, so the coding line hasn't filled all of space, then you can see that there's really some gaps here between the coding lines. And it turns out that if you encode and decode information over some reduced version of the range, so instead of going all the way up to e to the beta n, where beta is some constant close to 1, you instead encode over some range, some limited range, which is e to the rho beta n, where rho is an additional constant, which is smaller than 1. Okay? Now you have this empty space between the different segments of the coding line, and it's possible to also do error correction on the system, right? So any small perturbations of the word just map into this space here, which is this gray space, and as long as your perturbations are smaller than half the separation between these lines, it's possible to decode the position and back at a good estimate, denoise estimate of position. So this is a code where if you're restricting the coding range to some subspace of the full coding space, okay, where rho is this constant that's tells you how much smaller than the full capacity you're using, then the information rate of this code scales like about log of this restricted range over log of the full range, and that's rho. Okay, so you can dial in your information rate, and for that information rate, it's possible to achieve this exponential capacity in n. All right, and it turns out that if we look at the, in the presence of noise, if we use the same number of neurons using more conventional neural codes, then this is the decoded posterior estimate of positions, looks like this green curve here, but with the grid cell code using the same number of neurons and the same noise per neuron, you can now achieve posterior distributions that are much narrower. Okay, so, so this is a interesting property of this code, right? So now the thing that makes error correction possible is the fact that as this coding line, right, so this is this n-dimensional torus, which I've drawn only as a two-dimensional torus, but as x is increased, we talked about how this coding line continues to wrap around until at some point it covers all space. And I said what you can do is instead of going through that whole range of x's, these positions here, and stopping here when all space is covered, we're going to stop short and just short and stop here. Okay, so a property of this code that makes error correction possible is that these additional coding lines that would have been added if we'd kept going would have interleaved with all of these existing coding lines and fill space. Okay, but by decimating the range that I'm interested in coding, very conveniently, the portions of the coding space are decimated, interleaving with the existing coding lines, okay? It could have been that I had wrapped around the torus in a way where all the lines were closely packed locally here, and then when I decimated the coding line, there was all this empty space over there, right? That would not have led to noise tolerance and error correction, right? So it's this very nice interleaving property of the coding line as you continue increasing the range x that allows this error correction to happen. So in a sense, this is a generalization of sort of well-packed sphere codes for discrete variables. This is a generalization of well-packing of a line for analog codes. Okay, so just to contrast with known codes in the brain, you know, here is a conventional code that a lot of people are familiar with. This is like orientation tuning in V1. These are different neurons. Here's the stimulus angle. Here's the firing rates of these codes. Each neuron is firing some spikes as independent Poisson given those tuning curves. And so you get some number of spikes for some stimulus angle, and then you can then go ahead and decode the variable that is being encoded. And it's all worked out you know, through classic neuroscience literature, that the Fisher information of these codes scales like n, the mean squared error then scales like 1 over n, and the information rate of these codes, which is the log of the amount of number of bits used for representing the variable versus the log of the information bits versus the number of bits used to encode the variable goes like log n over n, and that itself goes to zero, okay? So the conventional neuroscience codes have information rates that go to 0, all right? So they have a linear decrease in the squared error, but at the cost of a linear decrease in information rate. Okay, and how much better is the grid cell code? Well, the grid cell code, if we look at the width of this posterior distribution of the decoded position divided by the width of the posterior distribution for these conventional codes, it's exponentially small in n. Okay, so the width is much smaller. All right, and so so that's actually an analytical calculation, and then we can also numerically verify that this is true. So in other words, so just to summarize this, the grid cell code really enables like exponentially better coding accuracy over range, this ratio of coding accuracy over range, than the classical population codes that we know from neuroscience, from the sensory and motor peripheries, and allows that to happen at a finite information rate rho. Okay, so in other words, the grid cell code really achieves a performance that's similar to strong error correcting codes in the Shannon sense. All right, so we already know that Shannon had proved that, before 1948, it was believed that it's not possible to have decreases in error while having a finite information rate. And what Shannon proved was that it is possible, and his theorem showed that it's possible to achieve asymptotically zero error at a finite information rate for discrete codes, and the corresponding analog statement for that is that you should be able to achieve exponentially vanishing error at asymptotically finite information rate, and that is what the grid cell code seems to achieve. Okay, so the interim summary here is that the grid cell code really can generate these unique representations for exponentially large ranges of location using linearly many neurons. It's capable of this very metric updating. So the code word for a sum of inputs is the sum of the code words of the two inputs. So that's a very unique property. Grid cell code is a strong error correcting code. And I would just like to point out as a sociological note that the discovery of these properties of the grid cell code was very much bottom up from my side, right? This is not, I didn't come in as a coding theorist saying, I'm going to look for, residue number system codes in neuroscience. I'm not going to look for strong error correcting codes in neuroscience. It really resulted from this discovery of grid cells and trying to understand why this puzzling representation for space, what are the mathematical properties of it, and a chain of deductive reasoning. So, bottom-up approaches really, I think, have a lot of promise still for neuroscience. I don't believe in the MAR hierarchy completely, software and hardware completely independent. I think there really is a sense in which, neuroscience discoveries are going to tell us a lot more about interesting representations and codes and computational abilities in the future. Okay, and all right. And so now just to the second part then. Okay, so these were all properties that we have discovered about what it is that a code in the brain is capable of, right? How much information can it encode? It's an encoding analysis, okay? And so, in coding theory, when people study codes, right, you've got some satellite has to encode, transmit some information. So what it does is it's got some information, phi, that it wants to send, it wants to transmit the source, it encodes it as x of phi, it goes through some noisy channel, and then the information, corrupted information reaches some decoder, and now the decoder is free to take its own sweet time and decode the transmitted variable, right? So, and so what we just talked about is Shannon's result, this theoretical capacity bounds on strong error correcting codes. Those all deal with information that, how much information can be encoded and pushed through a noisy channel, assuming the existence of some optimal decoder, right? But those capacity results don't take into account the decoding complexity and the decoding cost, okay? But, this is a duplicate. So I guess the question is that in the brain, though, we have to understand that the neural representations and memory in all of these systems, the encoder, the channel, and the decoder are all built by neurons, right? It's all using the same resources. We have to take into account, if the decoding involves exponentially many neurons, now you've sort of nullified the gains made by the encoding step. Okay, so we have to really try to understand whether it's possible to also do decoding of exponentially many states or denoising using linearly many neurons. And that's kind of the next question. Okay, so that brings me to talk about Hopfield networks, okay? And so Hopfield networks, I think, don't need too much introduction in this audience. They're defined by these units that are 1 or 0. Depending on the sum of the inputs that the units receive, they flip their state to be 1 or 0. Here's the inputs that each unit receives. to make that decision. And the dynamics in a Hopfield, and these weights are symmetric in a conventional Hopfield network. And with these dynamics and symmetric weights, one can write down an energy function, which looks like this. And the dynamics of the Hopfield network then are equivalent to descent on this energy surface. So, for example, if you have a Hopfield network that has some fixed points or some of these low energy states over here, and say this low energy state corresponds to some pattern here of neural activation, then if you initialize the system in some version of that state, that's a corrupted version of the state, the dynamics of the system do descent on this energy surface and bring this system back to that minimum and to that state. Okay, so because of this dynamics, the Hopfield network can equivalently be thought of as a model of associative memory, but you can also just think about it as a model for correction or completion dynamics or denoising in neural systems. Okay, and so I'm going to work within this paradigm over here. Okay, so I want to define a notion of robustness. So, so robustness means the ability of the system to correct or recover from some errors, but it means something specific in my case. So, what I want to say is that robustness involves correcting errors in a finite fraction of nodes. So suppose that every node has some probability, fixed probability of error, then the number of errors in a system will scale in proportion to the size of the system. Okay, so robustness means the ability of the system to recover from errors in a finite fraction of all the nodes. All right, and that's my definition of robustness. But for a system to satisfy that definition of robustness, it means that the basins of attraction in this dynamical system, in this energy landscape, the size of these basins must scale up as the network size scales up. Okay, so the basins should get bigger as the network gets bigger. All right, so let me then bring you to a brief history of the Hopfield capacity results, results on what it is that Hopfield networks are capable of in terms of capacity and how many states they can store and decode, and what the robustness properties of each of those states is. Okay, so typically, many constructions of Hopfield networks have the system storing very few states, but robustly. Okay, so if you have pairwise weights and random patterns, and you can store order n patterns with a small finite error, if you allow the system to have pth order connections rather than just pairwise weights, you can have pth order weights. Then the system can store order n to the p-1 patterns, but it's extremely densely connected, and it only becomes exponential when p equals n, which is that there are nth order connections in the whole network. So then it's sort of not a good situation. Okay, on the other hand, it's possible generically in these Hopfield networks to store very many states, but then not do it robustly, right? So if you have a completely random network, then also there are constraint satisfaction networks that were constructed by Hopfield and Tank and others. These allow for the construction of e to the square root of n states, and these states are not not robust at all to errors. Okay, so they can't recover. They have very narrow basins. Spin glasses, same thing. You can have order e to the n states, but again, they're not robust to finite fractions of errors. The basins are very narrow. And much more recently, there's some interesting constructions of Hopfield networks that can store e to the square root of n errors. They're partially robust. They can recover from some number of errors. It's not clear if the errors are proportional to the size of the network. And these are networks that are click networks with very specific configurations of connections within them. And these were actually done by Chris Hillar, who's here at the Redwood Institute in Berkeley, and his collaborator Tran, and by myself and Tran, the same co-author, and some other colleagues. So in general, either Hopfield networks have low information rate or are not robust. Okay, so that's the state of affairs right now, and the question is it possible to have exponentially many fixed points, so therefore exponentially decoding of exponentially many states in Hopfield networks in a way that is robust to finite fractions of errors in the system? Okay, so how many minutes do I have? Like 10? Is that right? I think we started after the introductions at 10 after, so I have 10 minutes. Okay, that's perfect. Great, thank you. Okay, so the question is this possible? Okay, is it possible to have these Hopfield networks with exponentially many states and robust basins? And so since the motivation here is sort of the motivation from error correcting codes, right, the motivation from the first half of my talk, we could just say, well, let's take a good error correcting code that we know is good and try to implement it in a Hopfield network directly, okay? So let's just take this famous 7-4 Hamming code, right? It's a good binary error correcting code. So the Hamming code, the 7-4 Hamming code has, 4 bits that carry information, so you can have a binary vector of length 4, and that's your sort of your source, it's your data, and each of these components is 1 or 0, okay? And now what you do is you take those 4 bits that are information carrying and embed it in a code word that's of length 7, okay? And so you've appended onto this 4-bit code word, this 4-bit source, you've appended 3 additional bits, right? 3 redundant bits. And these 3 additional bits are not independent of the coding bits. They actually satisfy the following properties. So they're parity checks, right? They check, they're checksums, if you will. And so the additional bits 5, 6, and 7 satisfy these 3 algebraic relationships where the sum mod 2 is 0 for each of these cases. Okay, and so here's the code. The optimal decoder, exists. You just recompute the 3 sums above. Given a noisy version of this code word, you just compute all of these 3 sums and call the first sum alpha, the second sum beta, the third sum gamma. And in fact, that number that you get, alpha, beta, gamma, is actually the index in binary of the incorrect bit. Okay, and so then you just go ahead and flip that bit addressed by alpha, beta, gamma, and that will correct the error. Okay, so the information rate of this code is 4/7 because there are 4 information bits out of 7 total used bits, and the capacity of this code actually you can compute from Shannon's theory, and it's 4/7 as well. So this code is really saturating the Shannon capacity, and this code actually corrects all 1-bit errors. So any 1-bit error in this code word can be corrected according to this algorithm, and it also signals when there's a 2-bit error, although it doesn't correct 2-bit errors. Okay, so the rate in this case equals capacity, and so now to embed this code into a Hopfield network, what we want to do is we want to make these code words, right, the allowed set of states here for these 7 bits. We want to make each of these code words become stable states of the Hopfield dynamics. Okay, that's what we would want to do to embed this in a Hopfield network. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take our 0s and 1s and map them into 1s and minus 1s. Okay, and remember these are the 3 constraints, the 3 extra sort of parity checks over here. And so what we can do is we can construct, if we write down an energy function that looks like this, where the energy function is given by the product of these, each of these terms is a product of the terms in these sums, okay, and we make all these j's equal to 1, this is, you can easily verify that this is an energy function that's minimized at all valid code words, okay? So the system has an energy minimum if this is the energy function for all valid code words. Okay, so that's nice, right? And because I've written down an energy function, it means I can write down, it's just a Hopfield network, but it involves these like 4-point couplings, right? These 4th order coupling terms between all the different nodes. So you've got 7 nodes here. These are the 7 nodes of this, in the network. Here are the edges. The yellow is like the, I don't know, it's the 2, 4, yellow is J, 2, 3, 4, 6, so it's that one. So the yellow is this 4th order connection here. The orange is 1, 3, 4, 7, so it's that connection over there, that 4th order connection, and so on, right? So now I've written down a Hopfield network that has as its minima the code words, okay? So that means that if you have a perturbed version of the code word, hopefully the system can correct the errors in the system. Okay, so with these weights or energy function, the code words are the minima of the dynamics, and we can obtain 2 to the 4 states with 7 neurons. Okay, so because all possible 4 coding states are allowed as long as those checks are validated. In fact, these 4th order edges seem really exotic. Can we even write down 4th order edges? Well, it turns out we don't have to write down 4th order edges. You can unpack these 4th order edges into just pairwise weights if you allow yourself, the construction of a bipartite graph, right? So hidden nodes in a bipartite graph can induce higher order dependencies. Okay, so are we done? Are we done? Can we go home? We have got now a construction of a strong error correcting code that can then decode noisy states. So actually, no, we're not done. So Hopfield dynamics cannot properly decode the Hamming code. So it turns out that so we've written down this energy surface. So this energy function over here. Here's a valid code word. It's the all ones code word, and the energy for this is -3. You can verify from here. Now let's just flip one of the bits. Let's flip that first bit, and now the energy goes from -3 to +1. Okay, and so so one way to decode is to flip back that one bit, and this is in the direction of reducing energy because you go back to -3, and this is the correct decoding step. But it turns out that the same energy dynamics also permit the system to wander in a different direction. So if you flip now the third bit, it actually reduces the energy because flipping the third bit actually reduces the energy to -1. So this is a valid direction for the dynamics to flow into. They're allowed to flow in this direction, or they can flow in this direction. But then if you flow in this direction, then the next downhill step will involve a third flip over here. And this results in, again, a very low energy state. Another correct code word, but it just so happens that it's an error because it's the wrong code word relative to the corrupted one. Okay, so the picture here, the geometric picture here is that you started at this perturbed version. This is the true code word. This was the perturbed version we started with. One iteration of the dynamics can bring you in this direction in the correct way, but the other iteration downhill also in the energy landscape can bring you to the other minimum. Okay, so in other words, you get suboptimal decoding by Hopfield dynamics, and small perturbations can map to the wrong or further away code word. Okay, so should we be surprised? You shouldn't be surprised, okay? Because in general, strong error correcting codes require very complicated decoding algorithms. They require things like belief propagation, which have a dynamics that's much more complicated than the dynamics of simple summation and nonlinearity at the nodes that typical neural networks can do. Okay, so they require non-biological decoding algorithms. Okay, so clearly it's not possible then to implement this Hopfield Hamming code in Hopfield networks. So the question is, can you do this at all for any kind of strong error correcting code? Okay, so I guess I'll just tell you the bottom line and then go very quickly just through some features that make this possible, and I'll end over there. Okay, so the bottom line of what I'm going to tell you is that it is possible to construct a robust and exponential capacity Hopfield network. So you have exponentially many states with linearly many neurons, and the basins of attraction scale with network size. Okay, so the system is robust, and the dynamics allow for correct decoding or noise reduction or error correction on them. Okay, so this is just the summary of the results. So if we can construct these networks where the number of states versus the size of the network. Note that this is a semi-log plot. It's growing exponentially with the size of the network. And moreover, if we look at the fraction of correct decoding events as a function of the percentage of input that's corrupted, okay, you can see that we get basically close to perfect recovery, even when just like a finite fraction, in this case about 4% or 6% of the nodes are corrupted. Okay, so this is the bottom line, right? This is what we were going for, and it's possible to do this construction. And so, so the summary here is it's possible for Hopfield networks to have exponentially many states and correct errors in a finite fraction of all nodes, and so it's possible to have robust exponential memory and decoding. Okay, so then the question is, how does this network work? Okay, and I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time here, but the architecture of this network is it's bipartite. Okay, so we've got input nodes, which are the nodes that are going to be learned and decoded, it's in this case, this construction that I showed you is regular. So each input node has a fixed number of outgoing edges. It's very sparse in weights, meaning that each node sends a fixed number of edges, okay, that does not scale with the size of the network. So as n goes to infinity, the number of edges divided by the size of the network goes to 0. Okay, so it's very sparse. The weights themselves have very low dynamic range. They're just binary weights, ones or zeros. This network has an expansion property, so small subsets of input nodes project to maximally large sets of these constraint nodes in this hidden layer up here. Each constraint node is a small Hopfield subnetwork. Okay, and so the architecture of the system, okay, is this case where I talked about this expansion property. Okay, so what is an expansion property? Here is a picture of good expansion versus bad expansion. Okay, so let's consider what's bad expansion. Suppose that each input node can send out only 3 edges. Okay, and let's consider the set of these 3 input nodes. If each node can send out 3 edges, right, the maximum size of the set that they project out to can be, if they project to completely disjoint sets in the hidden layer, then the maximum size of the neighbors outside in the hidden layer is 9, right? Because they're 3 times 3, so it's 9. But the minimum size is going to be just 3, because all 3 of these can project to, suppose they project to the same 3. Okay, so then the minimum size of their neighborhood is 3. So good expanders are graphs where the size of the neighborhood for a given number of outgoing edges is close to a maximum. It's large. Okay, and so a good expansion property is one where epsilon is close to 0. All right, so that's just the formal statement. And so I'm going to skip over some of these statements, but they sort of provide the guarantees on size, et cetera, that make the system work. Okay, so dynamically, how do we implement it? This is all Hopfield dynamics, Hopfield updating. So the inputs are initialized at their noisy, corrupted states, and a finite fraction of the states in that have been flipped. Okay, and then now these constraint nodes up here, which are each mini Hopfield networks, quickly equilibrate to the inputs that they're receiving. Some of these constraint nodes are, not satisfied because some of the input nodes that should have a certain sign are actually flipped, and that causes the constraint nodes to drive a flipping of the input nodes. And so the rule is that the inputs that are connected to more unsatisfied than satisfied input nodes actually switch state. Constraint nodes switch states, and when you iterate this over time with just Hopfield dynamics, we can prove that you can guarantee that the system will go to minimum energy state and it'll go to the correct state. Okay, and so conceptually, what this expansion property of this graph allows is it allows solving of the credit assignment problem. So in the Hamming network, the reason why the Hopfield dynamics didn't work is that when there were 2 errors in the input nodes, the system couldn't really determine which was the node in error. Okay, and now because of this expansion property of the graph, it's possible for this credit assignment problem to be solved, and the dynamics allow for the correct flipping of the corrupted nodes. All right, and so I'll just mention that we can actually do learning, so we can learn input patterns as long as the input patterns of the inputs consist of mixtures of constrained sparse subsets, and we can use contrastive divergence learning and a heterosynaptic competition term, which is like a L1 regularizer, and actually learn the structure of the input. So in other words, each constraint node will learn and find and connect to all elements of a jointly constrained subset of the input. So if there's small subsets of the input that are in a cluster and should be constrained together, they have relationships to each other, the learning will learn that. Okay, and so I'll just summarize, then I'll say the features are that sparse, random, and high-dimensional structures that I've described here, they have low weight complexity, and in high dimensions you can deterministically, it's hard to deterministically construct expander graphs, but in high dimensions it's very easy to do that. So random graphs can be expander graphs, and that holds tantalizing implications for biology. Each state is stabilized by a large number of constraints, but each of the constraints is very weak constraint on the set of input nodes that it connects to. It also provides some insight into why in biology we see these very interesting long-tail distributions of activation. So the Buzaki lab has these results, and many other labs have replicated the results where a few neurons are active all the time, and many neurons are almost active never. Okay, so it's really these sparse distributions of activity, these long-tail sparse activity distributions. They're ubiquitous in neuroscience, but from sort of coding perspective, it's very tough to understand why, right? You would want to equalize your burden that each neuron has. Why is it that you have these long tails? And in this case, the constraint nodes are very sparsely active, and the input nodes are densely active. And so there's this very natural sense in which most of the nodes are constraint nodes, sparsely active. A few input nodes are densely active all the time, and they're being corrected. Okay, so there are a lot of questions that we have about learning rules and but I would say that, really inspired by modern low-density parity check codes, we can construct these objects in high-dimensional spaces and actually even generalize them. So the low-density parity check codes usually have a lot of structure, but some of these constructions here, we can relax a lot of the structure that were used in proving theorems, but we still retain the properties. So lots of this work was done. The second half of the work was done by Rishi Chaudhary from my group, postdoc, and the first half was done by Sami Srinivasan, and Nok is a collaborator on some of these projects. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm going to take one question while Joe comes to set up.
So I have a quick one. So you mentioned learning at the very end. I think that was more in the Hopfield net context.
So the hippocampus does a lot of one-shot learning, where, you encounter some space, you come up with new place cells. Would you predict that the grid cell code, by virtue of being very dense,
I want to use my own.
would not be a place that you'd see a lot of plasticity in the same sort of way?
That's a good question. So far we haven't seen evidence. We also do a bunch of data analysis with grid cells. So far we haven't seen a lot of evidence for change, of plasticity in grid cells, in the sense that when we look across environments and across experimental conditions, the relationships between pairs of grid cells, like the activity relationships, whether they're coactive or not, tend to be quite preserved across environments. So it's true that in grid cells we wouldn't maybe expect to see too much plasticity, and we don't. And the question is whether hippocampal representations may be like these expander graphs and these Hopfield networks that can do error correction, and that's a great question. That's what we're thinking about lately.